Eleanor Whitmore had spent 7 years convincing the city that she was the kind of CEO who never lost her composure. And on the night the rain finally stripped that composure away, it was because she made the unprofessional decision to follow her own driver after work. She told herself she was only curious. She told herself it was a small precaution. But by the time the black sedan turned off the avenue and disappeared into a quiet Brooklyn street, she knew she was lying. She was searching for something. She did not yet know the name of it. She did not know that what she was about to find would carry her father's signature, a brass key, and the address of the only place in the world she had ever called home. The day had begun like any other. Eleanor's secretary placed a single porcelain cup of black coffee on the desk at 6:50. By 7:15, she was reading the merger summary that would either close on Friday or undo 2 years of careful work. By 8, she was standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her glass office on the 42nd floor, watching the East River turn the color of cold steel, and listening to the distant hum of the building waking up around her. The office had been her father's office once, in a smaller incarnation on a lower floor, and she had kept very few of his things when she moved upstairs. She had kept his fountain pen, which she did not use, and his framed photograph of the Brooklyn waterfront in 1987, which she had hung on the wall facing her chair, so that on the difficult afternoons she could look up from a contract and remember that her father had once stood beside that water as a young man and had imagined building something there. She did not look at the photograph that morning. She had looked at it the morning before, and the day before that, and she had spent 3 years cultivating the discipline of allowing herself only the smaller mercies. Her assistant, Maya, knocked once and stepped in without waiting. "He's downstairs," Maya said. "I told him 8:30, but he came at 8. The window was cool against Eleanor's forehead. She did not turn around for a long beat. "He always comes at 8, she said. Maya shifted her weight, the small hesitation of a woman who had been managing Eleanor's mornings for 3 years, and had learned exactly when not to push. "Do you want me to tell him to wait in the lobby?" "No," Eleanor said. "Let him stay where he is." Maya hesitated, the way she always did when she wanted to ask a question that was not strictly her business. Eleanor knew the question. Maya wanted to ask, again, why a woman who could afford any car service in Manhattan kept the same quiet driver who never spoke, never smiled, and never seemed to look anywhere but the road. Eleanor could not have explained it even to herself. So she did not give Maya the chance. She picked up her coat and walked to the elevator, leaving the question hanging like an unfinished sentence in the air. Daniel Hart was waiting beside the car when she stepped out of the lobby. He held the rear door open, the way he held it open every morning, with a kind of ordinary patience that should have meant nothing, and somehow always meant something. He was 28, the same age as she was, although she had only learned his age the day she signed his employment paperwork. He wore a deep navy suit that had been chosen by someone who understood tailoring, and the white shirt with no tie. He nodded as she approached. He did not say good morning. He never said good morning. "Westbrook Tower," she said. He nodded once. The small click of his door closing was the only sound for a half a second. "Yes, Miss Whitmore." She slid into the back seat. He closed the door. The car eased into the avenue, smooth as an exhale. She watched the back of his neck, the precise line where his hair met his collar, the slight tilt of his head as he checked the side mirror. She thought, not for the first time, that he drove like a man who was listening to something the rest of the city could not hear. She had grown up in cars driven by other men. Her father's chauffeur had been a kind, garrulous man named Joseph, who had told her jokes about the mayor and let her steer once on a quiet Sunday morning when she was 7. The drivers from the service she had used in her first 3 years as a chief executive had been polite and forgettable, and she had liked them for being forgettable. Daniel was not forgettable. Daniel was, she had come to understand, the only person in her professional life who never asked a single question he did not need an answer to, and who never volunteered a single sentence about himself. In a city built on the careful currency of small disclosures, the absence of small disclosures from him had begun, very gradually, to feel like the loudest thing in the back of the car. "Daniel," she said. His eyes met hers in the rearview mirror. "Yes?" She watched his hands on the wheel. They were a carpenter's hands, although she did not know yet that they were a carpenter's hands. The knuckles bore small, faded scars she had not previously noticed. "You're never late," she said. "You're never early. You're always exactly 2 minutes ahead." "How?" A long pause. Then a small, almost surprised smile that he caught before it could become anything more. "Practice," he said. "That isn't an answer." "No," he agreed, and said nothing else. The silence after his answer had a particular shape. She had begun to recognize the shape. It was the silence of a man who had been asked the kind of question that could only be honestly answered by giving up something he was not yet ready to give. She looked away and let the silence hold. Outside the window, the city was performing its morning ritual of pretending it had been awake all along. She thought about the merger. She thought about the board meeting. She thought, briefly and without permission, about the way he held an umbrella over her head one night last March, when the rain came down hard between the curb and the restaurant door, and he had walked the 4 steps with her under it, without being asked, and had then walked back into the rain alone. She had wondered, that night, who held an umbrella over him. By the time the car pulled to a stop in front of Westbrook Tower, she had pushed the memory back into whatever drawer it usually lived in. She thanked him. He nodded. She did not look back as she walked through the revolving doors. The merger meeting went badly. Not catastrophically, just badly enough to force her into a long afternoon of phone calls and small, careful corrections. The buyer's lead counsel was a sharp man from Boston who liked to test her by changing the order of questions, and Eleanor spent 2 hours holding the conversation steady while her own counsel scribbled neat little objections on a yellow legal pad and slid them across the table without looking up. By the time the call ended, the sky over the river had gone the dull color of pewter, and her shoulders had set into the small, high line they always set into when she was holding something heavier than a meeting. She walked the hallway to the elevator slowly. The cleaners were already out on the floor with their soft carts. They nodded to her as she passed. She nodded back. She had learned the names of every cleaner on her floor in her first month as chief executive, because her father had taught her, when she was 12, that the only people who knew the truth about a business were the people who emptied its bins. And she had not forgotten the lesson. By the time she stepped back into the elevator at 6 in the evening, the rain had started again, and her assistant had texted twice to ask whether she wanted a hot dinner sent up to the office. She did not. She wanted the car. She wanted to be driven somewhere. She did not particularly care where. Daniel was waiting beside the sedan as she came out of the lobby. He held the door open. He looked at her once, the smallest flicker of attention, and she was suddenly certain he had seen her exhaustion in the half-second before she could disguise it. He said nothing. He closed the door behind her with the same exact pressure he used every evening. "Home," she said. "Yes." He drove her the 17 blocks to her townhouse. The wipers ticked their slow, steady cadence against the windshield. She watched the rain bead and run on the side window and thought, for no reason she could name, about the umbrella in his right hand on the floor in front of the passenger seat. He held it the way other men held briefcases. He held the umbrella over her head as she stepped out. She paused, this time, on the second step. "Daniel," she said. "Yes, Miss Whitmore." "After you drop me, where do you go?" A small silence, then, "Home." The street lamp above the front steps flickered, the way that street lamp had flickered every wet October for as long as she had owned the townhouse, and Eleanor noticed, in the small intake of breath he made, that he had been waiting for her to ask the question for a long time. "Where is home?" He met her eyes. He did not look away. "Brooklyn." "What part of Brooklyn?" He considered her for a long moment. "Quiet part," he said. She almost laughed. She did not. She let him close the umbrella and step back to the curb, and she watched the sedan disappear into the grey rain. and she stood on her own front step, with her hand on the cold iron railing, and she thought, for the first time in a long time, that she was tired of not knowing things. Inside, she did not turn the lights on. She walked through the long hallway in her stocking feet. She passed the photograph of her father on the side table, which she had stopped pausing in front of years ago. He was standing in the lobby of the small boutique hotel he had owned for 23 years, the year before everything went wrong. The brass letters of the hotel's name were just visible behind his shoulder. She did not stop to look at them. She did not need to. She had memorized them when she was 9 years old, and she had not been able to forget them when she was 14. And the hotel had been taken away. She climbed the stairs. She stood at the window of her bedroom. She looked at the rain. She thought about Daniel Hart for 14 full seconds. Then she thought about him for 14 more. At 8 in the morning, she walked out of her townhouse, and instead of waiting for him to open the rear door, she said, "Get in the passenger seat. I'm driving." His face went through several quiet adjustments before he settled on something that resembled patience. "Miss Whitmore, get in," she said, "or stay here. Your choice." He got in. She drove badly for 3 blocks, and then better for the next 10, and he did not comment, and he did not flinch when she took a corner too fast. And by the time she handed the keys back at the office garage, she was almost certain he had been amused. She could not prove it. She wanted to. The board meeting was at 10. Frederick Orton, who had served on her father's board and now served on hers, leaned across the table at the end of the meeting and said, in the tone of a man who has already decided he is being kind, "Eleanor, dear, I noticed your driver as I came in. Is he doing all right? He has the saddest eyes I've ever seen on a man under 30. The table laughed. Eleanor did not. She set her pen down. "Frederick," she said, very mildly, "if I ever again hear you describe a member of my staff as a sad-eyed object of pity in front of my board, I will assume you have lost interest in serving on it." The room stilled. Frederick blinked. He recovered, as men of his class always recovered, and made a small joke about Eleanor's protective instincts. Eleanor smiled with no warmth at all, and adjourned the meeting. She did not tell Daniel about the conversation. He did not ask, but that evening, when he held the umbrella over her head, she said, "Whatever it is you have inside you that you keep so carefully, I want you to know that it is not invisible to me." He did not answer. He closed the umbrella. He stepped back. But for the first time in 7 months of driving her, his eyes stayed on hers a beat too long, and she understood, with a small and inconvenient clarity, that he had been waiting to be seen. She told herself she would not follow him. She told herself for 3 full days. She lasted until Thursday. On Thursday evening, the rain came down hard and steady, the kind of October rain that turned the streets into mirrors and made every cab a moving smear of yellow light. Eleanor stepped out of Westbrook Tower at 6. Daniel held the door. She did not get in. "I'm taking a cab tonight," she said. "I have an errand." He looked at her for a moment. He inclined his head. "Yes, Miss Whitmore." "You can go home." "Yes." He waited until she was in the cab. He closed the sedan's rear door, walked around to the driver's side, and pulled into traffic. The cab Eleanor had hailed pulled in 3 cars behind him, because Eleanor had given the driver an extra $100 and a single instruction. "Stay close to the black sedan, please. Do not lose it." The sedan drove south, then east, then over the bridge. The skyline shifted from glass to brick. The streets narrowed. The sedan slowed at the corner of a quiet block in a Brooklyn neighborhood she had not visited in 14 years. Eleanor knew the block before her cab driver named it. She knew it the way you know the shape of a name that has been spoken inside your house your whole childhood. Her hands went cold. The sedan pulled to the curb in front of a 4-story brownstone with a worn red awning over the front steps. The awning had no name on it any longer. There was scaffolding along the west wall. There were drop cloths visible inside the front windows. The building had been a small boutique hotel once. It had been abandoned for a long time, but the brass plate beside the door had been polished recently, and the letters were the same letters she had memorized when she was 9. The Marlowe. Eleanor sat in the back of the cab and watched Daniel Hart get out of the sedan in the rain. He did not bother with an umbrella. He went up the front steps 2 at a time. He unlocked the door with a key that hung from a long brass chain. He stepped inside. The lights in the front windows came on, one by one, the way lights come on in a house that someone is living in. "Ma'am," the cab driver said after a long minute. "Are we waiting, or—" "We're waiting," Eleanor said. Her voice did not sound like her own. She sat in the cab for 40 minutes. She watched. Daniel moved through the front rooms with the easy familiarity of a man who had been spending his evenings there for a long time. He carried a length of sanded molding past the front window. He paused at one point and stretched his back. He answered his phone, briefly, and laughed once at whatever the person on the other end said. She had never heard him laugh. She paid the cab. She got out. She walked across the wet street. She climbed the front steps. The door was not locked. She pushed it open. The smell hit her first. Sawdust and old beeswax. The smell her father had worn home on his cuffs every night for 23 years. "Daniel," she said, quietly, into the long, bright hallway. A pause, then his voice from somewhere upstairs. "Miss Whitmore." "Come down." He came down. He did not run. He was wearing a soft grey work shirt and jeans, and he was holding a sanding block, and there was a smear of pale dust on his cheek. He looked at her in the doorway, in her wet wool coat, and his face did not change. He set the sanding block on the front desk, very gently, the way a man sets down something he has been holding for a long time. "How?" she said. He did not answer. "How did you?" she said. "Why are you? Why is—" He took a slow breath. "Miss Whitmore." "Eleanor," she said. "If you are standing in this hallway, my name is Eleanor." "Eleanor," he said. She had never heard him say her name. The sound of it took 2 seconds to land. When it did, she had to put her hand against the doorframe to remember how to stand. She looked past him at the staircase, at the wallpaper she had picked out with her mother when she was 8, at the brass railing her father had taught her to slide down at the age of 6. She looked back at Daniel. "Whose hotel is this?" she said. He looked at her for a long time. "Yours," he said. "It has always been yours. I've been keeping it for you." The rain came down harder against the front windows. Eleanor closed her eyes. When she opened them again, Daniel had not moved, and she was crying without knowing when she had begun. She did not allow herself to ask the next question that night. She let him bring her a chair. She let him bring her a glass of water in a chipped tumbler that she recognized from the lobby bar. She let him stand near the desk, not too close, his hands folded in front of him in the patient, unobtrusive posture of a man who has been waiting a long time for a conversation and does not intend to rush it. She sat in the chair in her wet coat, and she looked around the lobby with the slow amazement of someone who is recovering a country. "How long have you been doing this?" she finally said. "A little over 5 years." 5 years? Yes. She let the number sit in the air between them. 5 years was more than half the time the hotel had been gone from her family. 5 years was longer than her father had lived after the 4. She had assumed, vaguely, every time she had passed a Brooklyn exit on the bridge, that the building was a shuttered shell or had been bought by some condominium developer. She had not, in 5 years, allowed herself to drive past it. "By yourself?" "Mostly." "While you were driving me?" He paused. "Yes." She looked at him. She looked at his hands and the small dust on his cheek and the soft grey work shirt that had clearly been washed many times. "Daniel," she said. "Why?" He looked down at his hands. He looked back up. "I would rather tell you that part somewhere warmer," he said, "and not on a Thursday." She almost laughed. She almost cried again. Instead, she said, "Drive me home." He drove her home. He did not say anything else that night. He held the umbrella over her head as she stepped out of the sedan. She paused on the second step. "Tomorrow," she said. "Pick me up at 7 instead of 8. I have a question." "Yes, Miss Whitmore." She held his gaze. The rain was a thin grey curtain at the edge of the umbrella. "Eleanor." A small pause. "Eleanor." She slept badly. She did not sleep at all, in fact. She lay in the dark and listened to the rain ease, and she counted the small things she had not previously counted. The way he had said her name. The way he had not run. The way the brass chain around his neck had held a single, long key instead of a collection of small ones. The way his hands had been steady as he set the sanding block on the desk, while hers had been shaking inside her coat sleeves. At 7 in the morning, she came down the front steps to find him standing beside the sedan. He looked tired. He looked, she thought, like someone who had been awake for the same reasons she had been awake. She got into the front passenger seat without asking. He closed the door behind her with the same exact pressure as always. "Drive," she said. "Where?" She looked at the dashboard, then through the windshield at the still pale dawn over the river. "Anywhere," she said. "And then tell me everything." He drove for an hour. He drove her down along the river and across the bridge and back. He did not start until they reached the Brooklyn side of the bridge for the second time. He started, when he started, with his father. "My father managed the Marlowe for 20 years, he said. Your father hired him in 1990. They became friends. My father said your father was the only man in the building business who treated his staff as though they were members of his own household." "I remember your father," Eleanor said quietly. "I remember a kind voice. I remember a man who used to keep peppermints in his desk." That was him. The peppermints had been in a small green tin. Eleanor remembered the lid. She remembered the way it stuck slightly when you opened it. What happened? Daniel kept his eyes on the road. "When your father became ill, the creditors moved within a week. The hotel was leveraged. The real estate firm your father started later was technically separate, but he had used the hotel as collateral on 3 different lines. The hotel was the easiest thing for them to take." "I know that part," Eleanor said. "I lived through that part." "There was a piece you didn't see," Daniel said. 3 days before the stroke, your father came to my father's apartment at midnight. He brought a folder. He said, 'I cannot save it for Eleanor. They are going to take it. But I can put the deed in the only name they cannot touch. Yours. You manage it. You hold it. And one day, when she is ready, you give it to her.'" Eleanor did not breathe. "My father refused at first," Daniel said. "He said, 'This isn't right.' Your father said, 'It is the only right thing left.' He left the folder. He went home. 3 days later, he had the stroke. The creditors came. The legal fight took 2 years. By the end of it, my father owned, on paper, a building that was structurally compromised, fully shuttered, and not worth defending. The creditors lost interest. Your father had been right about that, too." "And then your father was gone," Eleanor said. She remembered the small chapel, the gentle way the minister had spoken, the white roses on the altar. She had been 17. She had gone with her aunt. Daniel had been there, a tall, thin boy at the front of the chapel, who had not cried in any way she could see. "He left me the deed," Daniel said, "and a letter. The letter said, 'When she is ready, not before, you will know.'" "How did you know?" Eleanor whispered. He glanced at her, then back at the road. "I didn't," he said. "I waited. I worked. I drove for a service for 2 years to put myself through evenings of trade school. Carpentry, plumbing, electrical. I was not going to hand you a building that needed someone else's hands inside it. When your driver retired last year, I applied for the position. I told myself I was going to look at you once and decide whether you were ready. I told myself I would know in a week. And? His thumb tapped once, twice on the wheel before he answered. I knew in a week, he said. But the building wasn't finished. So I waited. The car came to a stop at a red light. Eleanor turned to face him. He kept his eyes on the windshield. She could see the small muscle work at the side of his jaw. Daniel. Eleanor. How much of my life have you been quietly carrying? He did not answer. The light changed. He drove. They pulled up in front of Westbrook Tower at 8. He did not get out. She did not get out. They sat in the front seat of the sedan, in the long, professional silence that had defined their last 7 months, while the city moved around them on the other side of the glass. I'm late for a meeting, she finally said. Yes. I will be late tomorrow as well. Yes. A taxi blew past on the avenue, throwing up a long sheet of grey water from the gutter. Neither of them flinched. And Saturday I am going back to the building. With you. I want to see all of it. Yes. And Daniel. Eleanor. She put one hand on the door handle and did not open the door. She kept her eyes on the street. Thank you, she said. I do not yet know what to do with what you have just told me, but I want you to know I heard it. All of it. He nodded. She got out of the car. She walked into the building. She did not look back. It would have been simpler if the city had let them have a quiet weekend. The city did not. On Saturday morning, the tabloid photo went up at 6 in the morning. By 7, 3 different gossip accounts had reposted it, and by 7:30, it was on Maya's phone. Maya called. You're going to want to see this, Maya said. Eleanor was standing at her kitchen island in a soft grey robe, her hair still damp from the shower. She set the kettle down very carefully. What is it? You and your driver, coming down the front steps of your townhouse, 12:58 a.m., last Thursday. Eleanor closed her eyes. The grain of the marble beneath her hand was very cold. He drove me home from an event. He held an umbrella over me. He went home. We were apart by 1 in the morning. I believe you, Maya said. The internet does not. What is the internet saying? Maya hesitated. The pause was the pause of a woman who had been protecting Eleanor's mornings for 3 years and had never previously had to deliver a tabloid headline. They're saying he is your young lover. They are saying you are out of your mind. They are saying the merger is at risk because the buyer's wife is conservative, and you have just become a tabloid story. They are saying. Stop, Eleanor said. I have heard enough. She hung up. She sat at her kitchen island. She drank a glass of water. She thought for 15 minutes. Then she called Daniel, who picked up on the second ring. Eleanor? Have you seen the photo? A pause. Yes. How are you? A longer pause. I am sorry, he said. She set her glass down. The apology had landed in her chest with a small, surprising weight. You did not take the photo? No. Then do not be sorry. Pick me up. We are going to the building. He picked her up at 10. The drive across the bridge was quiet. He did not turn on the radio. She did not look at her phone, which had begun, half an hour into the morning, to do that horrible buzzing thing that very expensive phones did when they were filling up faster than they could manage. She left it in her bag. He unlocked the front door of the Marlowe. He stepped aside. She went in alone. She walked through the lobby first. The wallpaper was new, but the pattern was the pattern she remembered. A soft, pale stripe in 2 shades of cream that her mother had chosen one summer afternoon in 1996, sitting on the lobby floor with 3 rolls spread across her lap and a half-eaten peach in one hand. Eleanor remembered the peach. She remembered her mother's laugh. She put her fingers against the wallpaper now and felt the careful pressing of a recently hung scene, and she thought that someone had taken great trouble to find the original pattern again, or to have it made. The brass railing on the staircase had been polished and re-anchored. The newel post still bore the small, almost invisible nick from a cricket bat she had swung wildly through the lobby at the age of 10, when her father had given her a long, gentle lecture about hotels not being the proper venue for cricket, and had then taken her outside to teach her how to bowl. The desk where her father used to stand was the same desk. There was a fresh ledger book on it, open. Daniel had been keeping it. She saw entries for paint, for floorboards, for plumbing parts, for new doorknobs in the rooms upstairs. The handwriting was small and neat and patient. It was the handwriting of a man who had been writing the same kind of entry into the same kind of book for a long time. There were dates beside each line. The earliest dates, on the first page she turned to, were from 5 years and 2 months ago. The most recent date had been entered the previous Tuesday. She walked up the staircase. She walked through the rooms. 6 rooms on the second floor, 6 on the third, and 4 small ones on the top floor that her father had once called the writers' rooms, because 3 different novelists had stayed in them across one improbably good summer. The wallpaper in those rooms had been rehung. The beds were unmade and stacked against the walls, waiting. There were small brass plaques on the doors with the original room numbers. Someone had cleaned each plaque by hand. She came back down slowly. Her hand trailed along the banister all the way to the lobby floor. The polished brass was cool under her palm. Daniel was standing in the lobby exactly where she had left him an hour earlier, his hands at his sides, his face turned toward the front transom and the soft fall of late morning light through it. He turned when she stepped onto the floor. He did not speak first. She walked across the floor, and she stopped a foot in front of him, and she said, "I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to think before you answer it." "Yes." "If I had never followed you," she said, "if I had never come to this door, when did you intend to give it to me?" He looked at her for a long time. "May," he said. "On your birthday." She felt the small click of recognition in her chest, the soft surprise of being seen by someone who had never before given any indication that he had been looking. "How do you know my birthday?" "It is on your employment paperwork." "You read your employer's employment paperwork?" "I read everything I am asked to sign," Daniel said. "I assume that is a habit you also have." She laughed. She had not meant to. The sound of it surprised her. She put her hand over her mouth, and then she lowered it and looked at him, and her eyes filled again. And he did not move toward her, but his face changed in a way she had not seen it change before. He looked, just for a moment, like a man who had been holding a great weight in front of his chest for 5 years, and had finally been allowed to set it down. "Daniel," she said. "Eleanor." She drew a breath. The dust motes turned slow and gold in the long bar of morning light from the front transom. "You and I are going to have a conversation about a great many things," she said. "We are going to have it slowly. We are not going to have it today. Today, I want you to walk me through every room and tell me what you did to it, and when, and why." "Yes." He did. They spent 6 hours in the building. He told her about the leak in the third-floor bathroom that he had spent 2 months tracing through the walls. He told her about the beam in the kitchen that he had reinforced himself with the structural engineer he had paid out of his savings. He told her about the original brass sconces in the upstairs hallway, which he had taken down and rewired one at a time because he had wanted to keep her father's lamps. He told her about the small back room that her father had used as an office, which he had not yet touched, because he had wanted her to decide what to do with it. She stood in the doorway of her father's office, and she pressed her palm flat against the wall. There were old marks on the doorframe where her father had measured her height every spring. The marks were still there. They were faded, but they were there. Daniel had not painted them over. She turned her face into the wall and let herself cry without sound. Daniel stood at the other end of the hallway. He did not approach. He let her have the room. She came out eventually. She wiped her face. "We are going to dinner," she said. "I am paying. You are eating. Choose somewhere you actually want to go." He looked at her for a moment, the quiet flicker of a man making sure she meant it. "There is a place 6 blocks from here that has the best soup I have ever tasted." "Then we are going there." They went there. She paid. He ate. They talked, for the first time in 7 months of driving, like two people who were no longer pretending one of them was not in the room. He told her how he had learned plumbing. She told him how she had learned to negotiate. He told her about his mother, who had taught him to read at 4 and had been gone by the time he was 15, and had left him with a love of paperback mysteries and a horror of unmade beds. She told him about her own mother, whom she had lost to a bad winter when she was 11, and who had taught her to set a table for 14 guests by the time she was 9. He told her, in a quieter voice, that his father had spoken about her father every Sunday until the day he himself was no longer well, and that he had grown up understanding her family in the way you understand a country you have never visited, but have heard about every day at supper. By the time they walked out of the restaurant, the rain had stopped, and the street lamps were just coming on. "Daniel," she said on the sidewalk, "I do not know what we are. I want you to know I do not know." "That is fair." The street lamp at the corner had just come on. Its light fell across his shoulder in a soft, cinematic line. "And I do not want you to drive me any more." He held very still. She saw him decide, very quickly, that he had misunderstood. She watched him decide to wait for the rest of the sentence. She liked him for the discipline of it. She put a hand briefly on his sleeve. "I will pay you the same wage until we figure out what comes next," she said. "I do not want my driver to be a man who is also rebuilding my hotel. It is not fair to you. It was never fair to you. And I will not sit in the back of a car owned by my company and call you Daniel." "Eleanor?" "Yes?" "That is fair," he said again, and he smiled. The small, careful smile she had been trying to learn the shape of for 7 months. And this time, he did not catch it before it became something more. The Whitmore board met on Monday. Frederick Auden led the questioning. He was kind, in the way men of his class were kind. He asked, with great delicacy, whether the photograph was a misunderstanding, and whether Eleanor would like to issue a statement, and whether the merger team was prepared to manage what he called the optics. Eleanor listened. She thanked him. She set a single sheet of paper on the table. "The photograph is not a misunderstanding," she said. "It is an accurate photograph of an inaccurate caption. The man in the photograph is named Daniel Hart. He is a carpenter, an electrician, a plumber, a former driver in this company's employ until last weekend, and the legal owner of a building in Brooklyn that he has spent 5 years restoring on my late father's behalf, in trust for me. You will all be receiving more details from my counsel within the week. The merger is not at risk. My personal life is not at risk. The board's authority over either is also not at risk, because I do not recall offering it." The room went very quiet. Frederick adjusted his glasses. "Eleanor, dear." "Frederick?" The other directors had gone very still. The young woman from the legal team was holding a pen above her notepad without writing. "Are you," he said carefully, "involved with this person?" "I am still discovering the precise shape of that question," she said. "Whatever the answer turns out to be, it will be mine to discover, not the board's. Are we clear?" A long silence. The radiator ticked once in the corner. "We are clear," Frederick said. The merger closed on Friday. It closed clean. It closed for a number of reasons, including Daniel Hart, whom Eleanor took to the closing dinner because the buyer's wife had heard a rumor, and Eleanor had decided she preferred to handle a rumor by sitting next to it in person. Daniel sat through the dinner in a borrowed dark suit and answered every question put to him with the same calm courtesy he had always answered Eleanor's questions, and at one point made the buyer's wife laugh by quietly correcting an art historian about the date of a portrait hanging in the restaurant. Eleanor watched. Eleanor learned. Eleanor said almost nothing for 2 full courses. Afterwards, in the car of a different driver, on the way back to Manhattan, the buyer's wife leaned across the aisle and said, "My dear, he is the most well-bred man I have met in a year. Where on earth did you find him?" "In my back seat," Eleanor said. The buyer's wife laughed for a full block. The closing went through at 11 that night. The wire transferred at 1 minute past midnight. Eleanor texted Daniel at 1:15. He texted back at 1:16. She thought about the discipline of a man who answered a text at 1:16 in the morning without ever once asking what she was doing awake. The next 4 weeks were quiet, in the way that important weeks were sometimes quiet. Daniel did not come to the office. He did not sit in the front of the sedan. He worked at the Marlowe during the day and met Eleanor for dinner 3 nights a week at the small restaurant 6 blocks from the hotel. He did not stay over. He did not press her hand in public. They ate soup. They walked the long way back to the building. They sat on the front steps and looked at the awning, and once, around the 3rd week, he reached very carefully and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear. And she let him. And she did not look at him afterwards, and he did not say anything. And they went on talking about door hinges, as though nothing in the world had changed, and as though everything had. The weather turned during those 4 weeks. The October rain gave way to a cold, dry November. The leaves in the small park across the street from the Marlowe turned from yellow to the deep red of old wine. One Saturday, Eleanor sat on a bench in that park and watched a woman teach her small son how to ride a bicycle with training wheels. And she thought, with a quiet ache she did not bother to hide from herself, that she was going to want a great many things she had not previously allowed herself to want. She did not say so to Daniel. She did not need to. He arrived at the bench 15 minutes later with 2 paper cups of hot chocolate and a folded blanket, and he sat beside her on the bench, and he handed her the cup and arranged the blanket over both of their laps without a word, and she leaned her head against his shoulder and watched the boy fall and laugh and get back on the bicycle, and she understood, for the first time in years, what it felt like to be in the company of someone who had been paying close, gentle attention to the inside of her life for a long time. On the 2nd Saturday in November, the tabloid printed a follow-up. The follow-up said, in respectful language that the tabloid was clearly not used to using, that the building Daniel Hart had been restoring was the original Whitmore family hotel, and that the project had been undertaken at the personal request of the late Charles Whitmore, and that Eleanor Whitmore had declined to comment. The piece called Daniel remarkable. The piece called Eleanor fortunate. Eleanor read it twice and laughed, alone in her kitchen. She called Daniel. "Did you read it?" "I did." "Did you say a single word to anyone at that paper?" "I did not." She had not really thought he had. She had needed to ask anyway, because asking was, she had recently begun to understand, a kind of small honesty that mattered. "How did they get the story?" "Frederick Auden," Daniel said, very gently. Eleanor blinked. "Frederick?" "His wife's cousin works there. He told her, last week, that he had been, quote, instrumental in introducing a young man of unusual character to the Whitmore family. I assume he is rebuilding his standing on the board." She set the kettle back on the burner with a small, decisive click. "He is rebuilding his standing in the obituary section if he says one more word," Eleanor said. Daniel laughed. She loved the sound. She was no longer pretending, even to herself, that she did not. The Marlowe reopened on the 1st Saturday in May, Eleanor's birthday, as Daniel had once intended. The brass plate beside the door had been polished in the morning. The awning was new, but the color was the same red her father had chosen in 1989, the deep, velvet red of an old theater curtain, slightly muted by the light. The lobby had been finished by hand. There were fresh white peonies on the front desk in a heavy crystal vase that Eleanor recognized from her childhood, and there were small bowls of the same striped peppermints that Daniel's father had once kept in his drawer, set on every side table. The rooms upstairs were full of guests who had been on a waiting list for 2 months. The kitchen had been opened at 5 for a breakfast service that Daniel had spent 6 weeks designing with a young chef from Queens, whom he had found at a Sunday morning farmer's market and had quietly persuaded to leave a much larger restaurant. There was a small sign on a brass easel near the front desk that said simply, "Managed by Daniel Hart." There was no sign that said anything about Eleanor. She had asked for that. The reopening party was small and warm. There were 40 people in the lobby. Eleanor's aunt was there, leaning gracefully on the polished bar, surrounded by a small group of women who had known Eleanor's mother. Maya was there in a green silk dress, weeping quietly into champagne. Daniel was there in the same dark suit he had worn to the closing dinner, standing near the staircase, looking, for the first time Eleanor had ever seen, slightly overwhelmed. A photographer Eleanor did not recognize approached the bar. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "may I ask one question?" "You may ask." He held a small leather notebook in one hand. He did not lift his camera. He had been hired by the hotel itself, she remembered, to document the night for the new website Daniel had been quietly building. "Whose hotel is this?" Eleanor looked across the lobby at Daniel. He met her eyes. The polished brass of the railing behind him reflected the lobby's chandelier in a long, soft seam of warm gold. She turned back to the photographer. "Ours," she said. She walked across the lobby. The crowd parted in the small, instinctive way crowds parted when a private moment was about to happen. She stopped a foot in front of Daniel. He looked at her with the same patient, unhurried attention he had brought to every door he had ever opened for her. She put one hand on the lapel of his jacket. She rose onto her toes. She kissed him in the lobby of the hotel her father had built, in front of the brass railing she had slid down at 6, beside the ledger book Daniel had been keeping for 5 years, in a soft pause of the room's quiet music. And, after she stepped back, she said, "Thank you for not waiting for May." "Eleanor." "Yes." "It is May," he said. She laughed against his shoulder. The room laughed with her, gently, without intrusion. He held her elbow. He held nothing else. He did not need to. Later that night, after the last guests had gone, after Maya had been put into a cab, and Eleanor's aunt had been escorted upstairs to the writer's room she had asked for, Eleanor walked Daniel out onto the front steps. The May rain was coming down soft and steady, the way May rain in New York always came down, as though the city was apologizing for being so beautiful. She held the umbrella over his head. He looked at her. She raised her eyebrows. "You held it over me for 7 months, she said. "It is your turn." "Eleanor." "Yes." The umbrella over his head darkened the warm color of his hair to something nearly black. He looked, she thought, both younger and older than he had ever looked behind the wheel of her car. "I have been waiting to hear my name and your voice in this doorway my entire adult life." "I know," she said. She closed the umbrella. She slid her arm through his. They stood on the front steps of the Marlowe, beside the brass plate her father had ordered in 1989, and listened to the soft hush of May rain on the awning, and watched a single yellow cab disappear into the long, polished avenue. And they did not say another word for a long time, because they did not have to. She had followed him after work, once, on a Thursday. He had spent 5 years walking out ahead, because he had understood, before she had, that the only way home she could not find was the only way home he could give her. It was the kind of ending the city did not usually print. Eleanor did not mind. She had her hand in his, and the rain in front of them, and a brass key hanging on a long chain around his neck, and a portrait of her father going up in the lobby in the morning. The rest she was content to discover slowly, in the deep, ordinary way she had discovered everything else worth keeping. Her driver, after all, had taught her how.